good morning, everybody. Our main theme going through February, as you've probably gathered by now, is grace. It's an immense topic. And grace, I find, is one of those words, and there's many words in the Bible, that we kind of know what it means, but then we actually try and articulate it, and it gets a little bit more tricky. But grace is something that fundamentally you cannot earn, because if you could earn it, it would no longer be grace. It would be a reward. So just looking around, thinking of who I can pick on by name, and I can see John Newman down there. Hello, John. Now, if John was really good to me, as if he wouldn't be, but if John was really good to me, and then I was really good to him, that wouldn't be grace. That would be a reward or a transaction. But if John, if you could imagine such a terrible thing, was really bad to me, and then I was good to him, that would be grace. You see, you can't earn grace, otherwise it ceases to be grace. So why is grace so important for us to understand? I think it's because as believers, when we really grasp grace, and we've sung this morning some wonderful grace worship songs, when we really get the grace of God, it will fill us with an overwhelming sense of gratitude and appreciation for God and all that he's done, and joy and wonder and just immense wonderfulness. Wow, God is so gracious. And this morning I want to unpack a parable which is very familiar, which I think is one of the best parables when we're coming to look at grace. If you've got your Bibles with you, turn to Matthew chapter 20. And we're going to be looking at the parable of the workers in the vineyard, parable that Jesus taught. So Matthew chapter 20. The thing is, when you get carried away with the worship and then you come up here, you realize you've got very little voice left. Okay, Matthew 20 says this: "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' And so they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon, and he did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, 'Why have you been standing here all day doing nothing?' 'Because no one hired us,' they answered. And he said to them, 'You also go and work in my vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, 'Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first.' The workers who were hired at 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. So when those who came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. 'These who were hired last worked 1 hour only,' they said, 'and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day.' But he answered one of them, 'I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give to the one who was hired last the same as I gave to you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?'" I love parables, but parables have got more meaning, I think, and they're more interesting to really look at if we know a little bit more about the context into which they were first told. So here's a few interesting facts about this parable, the context of it, which I think will be helpful. First of all, the day laborers. Day laborers were very needy people. You know, they were the ones that would have woken up every morning not knowing what the day would bring, not knowing if they would get work, not knowing if therefore they would get money, and therefore whether they would eat and be able to support themselves and their families. They lived their life like that. They were only ever hired for a day, hence they were called day laborers. In many respects, they were worse off than even slaves, because at least slaves knew what they were about and probably knew where their next meal was coming from. The second thing of interest is that the wage of a denarius a day was the wage of a Roman soldier. It was much more than the wage of a day laborer in terms of social acceptance and legal entitlement. So even if you were going to work all day, that one denarius was way more than you would naturally expect it to be. And then the third thing, just as way of interest, that the working day was a 12-hour day from 6 a.m. till 6 p.m. And it helps to know these things. So here's the first question. Who do you suppose was the most grateful for his wages? The last one. That's a pretty obvious answer, isn't it? It was the one who worked just 1 hour would have been overwhelmed. And you know, he was probably going through that day losing hope as each hour went by. He wasn't hired at 6 o'clock, and then the guy came out again at 9 and he wasn't hired, and then it was 12 and he wasn't hired. And by the time 5 o'clock came, he had probably lost all hope. But then finally, he gets hired at the 11th hour, and probably he would have thought, well, at least it'll be something. I don't know what the equivalent of pennies would have been in terms of the breakdown of a denarii. But he might have had a few pence, maybe to have got a small amount of bread for his family, but it wasn't going to be much. So imagine their amazement when they get a whole denarius. I mean, that was unthinkable. It was incredible. Way more than they would have ever expected. But what's happening to the other workers? I think it's interesting that in this parable, Jesus says the vineyard owner says, pay the ones who were hired last first, so that all the other people are going to be able to see this. And what happens to them? You see, it's not unreasonable that the ones that were hired first are in the queue waiting to be paid, thinking to themselves, this is going to be amazing, because clearly he's put up his rate. Because for 1 hour, you get a denarius. Hey, I started at 6. I'm going to get 12 denarii. I'm going to be minted. And so you can imagine the disappointment when at the end of it, he still only gets his 1 denarius. It's not fair. But remember, a denarius is more than he should have got in the first place. And what seemed like a good rate of pay at the beginning, by the end of the day, seems inadequate and unfair. But if the vineyard owner had paid them what they deserved, none of them, not one, would have got a whole denarius. So what does this parable tell us about the vineyard owner? Well, it tells us that he is paying the workers with a very generous heart. He knows what they need, not what they're entitled to by law. It shows that he is not only generous, but he is lavish and abundant, giving them way over the going rate. And it shows us the heart of the vineyard owner. And remember, this parable starts like many other parables where Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like this. The vineyard owner is God. It is God who goes out and calls the laborers. That's us. We are the laborers who God has called. And our wages are all of generous grace. Not any sense of what society might tell us that we're worth, but by what God says we are worth. And it's all of generous, lavish, abundant grace. So which of the laborers do we identify with? You know, it can be a sad fact that the longer we are a Christian, the easier it is to veer away from the excitement, the joy, the lavish acceptance of God's grace of the 11th hour worker towards the one who started at 6 a.m. in the morning. God, I'm working my socks off for you here. I'm doing all these things for you and for your kingdom, and I see my brothers and sisters, and some of them aren't doing anything. It's not fair. That's why we can feel empathy with the 6 o'clock in the morning workers, because we know what that feels like. It's a bit like Martha and Mary. We have more empathy with Martha than we have with Mary, because in us, there is something that is saying, I am working and therefore I should be paid. And when we look at other people who are not working, we struggle with that, if we're honest. Of course, we're all so Christian and polite. We wouldn't really like to admit to thinking these things, leave alone saying them, but it's there. That's why we have empathy with the workers who worked the whole day. You could have been a Christian all your life. You could have worked through the long hours of the day in the heat of the sun, very sacrificially, very diligently. And then someone comes along right at the end of their life, maybe even on their deathbed, and gives their life to Jesus. And do you know what? They get paid the same as we do. That's what this parable is teaching. And it is all of God's generous grace. I've been a Christian nearly 30 years. And when I first became a Christian, I was in every service that this church held. And I worked in every volunteer capacity I possibly could. I brought Jesus into every conversation if I possibly could. And it was exciting, and it wasn't a big deal. It was just like, this is just the way it is. I was filled with the Holy Spirit, and I was out there, and I was going for it, and it was all amazing. But there came a time when my bed was a bit more alluring in the morning than the morning service, especially in the winter. And what about midweek prayer meetings? When we're at home and you've had your dinner and you're sat in front of the telly and it's warm and you've got your slippers on, and then you think, I've got to get up and out in the cold. That first thrill of receiving the grace of God somehow wears down. And it's not good to stay in that place. I wonder what happened when the labourers went home that night. Can you imagine the 11th hour worker going home? There he is. He's got his money, a whole denarius, 1 hour's work. Absolutely amazing. He goes, he gets food. He takes it back to his family and his friends in his village or whatever the context was. He's like, I have met the most amazing vineyard owner ever imaginable. I've had such an incredible day. There I am. I'm desperate. No hope. I didn't think I was going to eat today. And then this incredible vineyard owner gives me a whole denarius. Come and meet this vineyard owner because he is amazing. He's got so much generosity and grace and etc., etc. And the people around me go like, wow, take me to this vineyard owner. The guy who worked from 6 o'clock in the morning, maybe he went home. And yeah, he bought food. He had a denarius, same as the other guy. And he would have taken it back to his family and his village friends. And they'd have said, you know, have a good day. And he said, yeah, well, it was okay. I worked really long and really hard. And it was unbearable at the beginning of the day. But hey, I got paid and here's your food. The people that hear about the vineyard owner from this guy aren't going to be drawn to meet him. But the people who hear about the vineyard owner from the 11th hour worker, and I want to meet this guy. So how do we talk about Jesus? Do we talk about Jesus to our friends and our neighbors and our family like the 11th hour worker so that they say, I want to come and meet him? Or do we just kind of do the stuff day after day and we work long and hard? And yeah, we know about God's grace, and yes, we know that we're going to get paid a fair wage and all that, but somehow the passion has gone, the enthusiasm has gone. because we've been working all day and we've lost sight of the generosity of the wages. If we want to enjoy the grace of God and to proclaim the incredible gospel of grace, we need to think of ourselves all the time as 11th hour workers and not lose sight of the generosity of God that we have in Jesus. Because when we lose sight of that generous grace, we won't be able to proclaim it in the same way. You know, statistically, and I haven't got the statistics, but statistically, when people become a Christian, the vast majority, hugely high percentage, hear the gospel from someone who's been a Christian for less than a year. And when I look back over my own life, I can see that. I talked a lot more about Jesus to everybody I met, probably in the first year that I was a Christian. We need to keep ourselves thinking of ourselves as 11th hour workers and get that passion for sharing our faith. My fear is that the church in this nation is by and large made up to a greater extent of people who think of themselves as all-day laborers and not 11th hour workers. And they've lost sight of the grace of God and what that actually means. You know, we've all received grace. There's common grace and then there's saving grace. Common grace is for all of us, every human being on the planet. We all have common grace of God. We have air, we have food, we have water, we have physical bodies. That's the common grace of God. Saving grace is only to be found in Jesus. And when we've got saving grace and we come alive spiritually, that's when we get into the vineyard, having received that wonderful grace from God. Some of you, many of you probably, have read a book by Philip Yancey called What's So Amazing About Grace. And he wrote that book because he heard of a conversation where a guy had met this woman and she was a prostitute. Not only was she a prostitute, she was a heroin addict. And not only was she a heroin addict, she actually rented out her daughter to feed her addiction. She was about as low as a human being could go. Totally desperate. And somebody said to her, "You really should try and go to church." And her response was, "Why will I go to church? I feel bad enough about myself as it is without going to church and being made to feel a whole lot worse." We have lost the message of grace. That's why Philip Yancey wrote that book. It's a good book. It's quite old now, but I'd read it if you can. Where has the church gone wrong in the United Kingdom in proclaiming the incredible, beautiful grace that Jesus brings? How have we become a people that in many communities around us see us in the main as judgmental and hypocritical at best and simply irrelevant at worst? How has that happened? And I think one of the reasons it's happened is because we have lost sight of the grace of Jesus, the beauty of Jesus and who he is. Something in us still goes to that default position of a works-based reward system. If I'm good, God will reward me. And if I'm bad, God will not reward me. Rather than starting from a place which says, I deserve nothing, but I have received such grace. Let me tell you about the vineyard owner. I've enjoyed preparing this. It raises challenges. The first challenge is this: how far from the 11th hour worker is my attitude on a day-to-day basis? Second challenge, do I ever look at other Christians with a little bit of resentment creeping in? They're not putting in the hours like I am. Third challenge, have I still got my first passion and excitement that I had when I first received God's saving grace? And lastly, can I really take it in? really, really take it in that it is only by grace and not by works. I want to invite a friend of mine up onto the platform. Marion, if you would come up. You know, when you stand up here and preach, it's all good, but sometimes it helps if you kind of ground it in a real person, in real terms, in a real way, with a real life. This is Marion. Do you grab that?
Thank you.
Marion, you've known Jesus.
Yeah,
You can sit down, yeah? I'll sit down too. Oh, I kind of feel like, who was the guy with the finger missing? Dave Allen, yeah.
Oh dear.
I kind of want to put my fingers down now. Marion, you've been a Christian a long time. Tell us how you came to understand the saving grace of Jesus.
Well, it's only as you look back on your life as you get older that it made me realise how God works through my life many years ago before I even realised that I was a Christian. It started when I was a young child, sent to Sunday school, as many people were in those days. And I went reluctantly with two younger brothers because my parents never ever went to church. But we were sent to Sunday school every day. And that was apparently the way they'd been brought up, and they felt that was right for us. But while I was there, I met a Sunday school teacher who really impressed me, had an impression on my life in the way that he could tell stories about Jesus that were quite exciting and thrilling. So by the time I was 10, I can remember this Christmas coming up, and we were asked what we would like for Christmas. And I said I wanted a Bible. Now, in those days, we didn't get much for Christmas because money was tight and it was after the war years. And my parents said to me, is that really what you want? And I said, oh, yes, I really want a Bible. So that's what I have for my Christmas box. And I was thrilled. And I read this Bible, and I went on going to Sunday school and thought I was there. That was it, you know. I know Jesus, and I'm now a Christian. Meant a lot. And then as I got older, it all went by the wayside. I became a teenager and a young adult, and I got married. And I didn't think an awful lot about Jesus anymore. He sort of didn't peter out my life. He was always in the background. And sometimes I used to go past a church that was nearby, and I used to see all these people gathering outside, and used to think, one of these days I'll go into that church. There must be something they've got there that I don't know about. But anyway, we went on, and into my 30s, I'd had 3 small children, and we moved here. And when we moved here, my kids went to the local school, 2 of them, and my son was only 5, and he went into this school, and after 2 or 3 weeks, he came home, and he said to me, Mum, he said, I've met a friend who knows Jesus. Can you tell me who Jesus is? Who is this Jesus? And I struggled really to tell him. I only knew what I'd known from Sunday school, so I told him I'd been to Sunday school. And he went because he wanted to go. So I spoke to the friend's mum, and she said, yes, we'll take him along. And he went 2 or 3 times, and he came home, my Paul, at 5, and he looked me in the eye, and he said, now, if I'm going to church, why aren't you coming? And you know, when I
mouths of babes.
When I look back now, I think God's got such a sense of humour. So I thought about it, and I said to my husband, I think we need to go. And he said, yes, no, you're right. We both had experiences of being reluctant and cross because Mummy and Daddy didn't go when we were young. So off we came here, and I walked into this place, and my life changed. I can't say how it changed specifically, but I came in, it was very welcoming. It was in the 70s, mid-70s. I came into this church, and I was welcomed, and I felt blessed, and then I listened to Jim's teaching, and it was so simple. and so open and so lovely. It's something I could understand completely and utterly that resonated with my own life. So, wow, that was the start.
So you became a Christian, you received that grace
I did.
of Jesus, and then from then on in your life was a piece of cake.
Not at all. Not at all. It was more difficult, really. Not the first couple of years were okay. We all came as a family and everything was going along beautifully. And then my husband decided he wasn't coming anymore, which was quite heartbreaking. And my kids still came for a while, and as they grew older, they suddenly said, well, if Daddy's not going, why should we go? And I had this real feeling that this is awful, Lord. And I know that you are God, and I just know that I've got to keep going. So I came still on my own in the end, every week. And wasn't easy at home because my husband couldn't see why I had to make it a priority on a Sunday to come. And the kids did their own thing. Well, they were older by then. And I hadn't been baptised at that point because I used to sit at the back thinking, oh, you know, I don't think I could go that far, Lord, because it's embarrassing going up the front. I didn't like anything like that. And I'd been coming about 5 years, I think. And one day, we used to have lots of baptisms years ago in the 70s, and they announced that there was going to be a baptism service, and anybody that wanted to go or come forward should meet this guy, this Peter Faulkner, and have a chat with him. And I sat there and I thought, well, I don't know who Peter Faulkner is anyway, Lord, so, you know, I'm out. And he said very clearly to me, it's your turn. It's your turn, and I want you up in that baptismal pool. And I went home, and I had all sorts of excuses. I said, Lord, stood at my kitchen sink, actually, and I said, Lord, you know, I can't do this. My husband won't like it. It'll be very difficult at home once that happens. And God said very clearly to me, this is where I want you to be. And then I said, but I don't know who Peter Faulkner is. This is me and God talking in my mind. And he very clearly gave me a picture of this man, showed me who he was. That's who I want you to see.
Amazing.
And that's what I had to do. And it completely changed me, is all I can say. I was absolutely amazed.
And then you hit quite a difficult time.
I did. After
children.
that, once I was baptised and all my family came, which was good. My father said, you're taking this far too seriously, my girl. But anyway, they came. And it was some years after that, not so many years, that things started to happen that weren't very good. And without going into lots of detail, I lost a child, which a babe, you know, I was pregnant, and that didn't come to what it should have done, and I felt very guilty, and for a long time I struggled over that, and I struggled and struggled with it, and one day I said to God, you know, I'm really sorry this has happened, you could never forgive me. And he said very clearly, I forgave you when you asked me a long time ago, you need to forgive yourself. And from that point, I realised how amazing his grace was. And then other things went wrong late, and a few years later, I had a daughter who, my youngest child, who was very mentally ill. She had drug addiction, she had anorexia, she had suicidal tendencies, which went on and on and on for many years. And I really struggled with that.
It was God's grace that held you.
It was, because I can remember saying one day to God, I'm holding on here by my fingernails, Lord. I don't know where to go with this. And he said very clearly to me one day, my grace is sufficient for you. And my power is made perfect in weakness. And, you know, that's engraved on my heart. And I've known that from that moment on that I was in his hands. There's nothing I could do, but he could do all sorts of things. And she was saved when she was 40. So hallelujah, Lord.
Yeah, she
But
was. I baptized her.
You did. You did indeed.
It was so cool. And then tell us very briefly about your husband's journey after that, because obviously he didn't ever really return to church.
No,
did
he didn't. He didn't return to church. He became a mason, and he said it was much the same thing, and, you know, I wasn't to criticise it, which I didn't. And I very much felt that this marriage I should respect, and God enabled me to respect my marriage, and I did love my husband dearly. So we went on from there, and then one day when he was in his 50s, he was diagnosed with cancer. And from start to finish, it was about 9 months. And during that time, all I could think of, I only wish he knew you, Lord. I only wish he knew you. And after a couple of 2 or 3 months, he was ill. My then house group leader, Brian McCarthy, said he was going to come and talk to him. And he came not once, but many times. And every time he came, he used to say to me, you go for a walk, Marion. I'm just going to have a chat with Brian. And he did. And I said to him one day, do you think it's making any difference at all? And he said, I know it is. But I never saw it until the day he died. And I didn't really see it then, but as I explained to Maria, the day he died at home. And as he was dying, the GP had come because he was so poorly, and we were sat on the bed, this GP and Brian had collapsed on the floor. And as he said, the GP said to me, this is not, he's dying. Hold his hand. And I knelt down and held his hand. And a flood of prayer came from me. And I don't know where it came from. I wasn't crying. It was just a thanksgiving. Thank you, Lord, that you have been a wonderful father to me and enabled me to cope with all things in life. And I just want to thank you for my marriage and my husband. And I just ask that he will be with you now. And I had a real peace that God took him to be with him. And it's by his grace. It's only by his grace that I got through all those years. And even now, as a widow, his grace still touches my heart in so many ways. How can you fail not to be full of the love of God to others when he has been so wonderful to you?
Amen. Well, thank you so much. Let's give her a round of applause. Well done.